Hello, everybody. Welcome to the discussion on the future of open source observability. I'm Priyanka Sharma, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is the home for over 100 open source projects, and some of which are very well known, such as Kubernetes, Envoy, Prometheus, Jaeger Tracing, OpenTelemetry, and so many others. I am so thrilled to be here speaking with you today because I started my infrastructure career in observability. I used to be a contributor to a project called Open Tracing, and it was the third one to join the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And I had a great time educating the world about distributed tracing and how tracing was fun, and a lot of other similar things in the vein of understanding your highly complex distributed systems better. Today, I am moderating a panel for you here, and we have with us open source experts who are going to share their thoughts on the importance and future of open source observability. Just so you know, if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat. At the end of the session, we are going to go one by one and try to go through as many as we can. All right. So let's get started. So I've already told you all who I am. I'd like to get the panelists to do the same. How about let's start with you, Bartek.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Bartek Plotka. I live in London and I work on open source observability at RedHat. I'm the maintainer of two bigger CNCF projects, Prometheus and Thanos. And I'm also active in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as the CNCF ambassador and TAG Observability Tech Lead. I'm also writing a book with O'Reilly called Efficient Go. How I got involved in open source? Well, I will be honest. I had an amazing mentor that was patient enough to review my PR to Apache Mesos 6 years ago. So yeah, that's it. This is how I fell in love. And yes, mentorship is very crucial in open source.
100% agree, Bartek. That's how I got in as well. So many people lent a hand and pulled me in, which was amazing. Now let's ask Jack to introduce himself. Oh, I think you're muted, Jack. Sorry.
Sorry about that. My name is Jack Berg. I've been writing software and have been a consumer of open source for quite some time now. I've worked in a variety of languages, but have most experience working in service-oriented architectures with Java. I work for New Relic. I joined here about a year ago to help with open source Java initiatives, and I currently spend most of my time working on the OpenTelemetry Java project. So yeah, hello.
Excellent stuff. OpenTelemetry is the latest and the greatest, so I'm very excited about all the work that's happening there. Melissa, would you like to introduce yourself now?
Great, thanks. Yes, I'm Melissa Klein. I am the open source program manager at New Relic. I run our open source program office. I've been doing open source program work for a lot of years, but I started my career as a Java developer, working with open source frameworks and things in that development. And so I learned to love open source as a developer and moved over to the program management space.
Excellent. None of us could contribute as successfully to open source as we do without the OSPOs supporting us. I'm glad we have Melissa here to provide that perspective. Next up, hey, Michelle, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Nguyen, and I am a principal software engineer at New Relic, and I am one of the core maintainers of Pixie. And Pixie is kind of just my first beginning in my journey in open source, and I'm just super excited to be able to go and just meet everybody in the community and learn about open source through this way.
Oh, that's awesome. It's so cool to hear that, Michelle. Yes, Pixie is a CNCF sandbox project, and I really hope you're finding the community welcoming and meeting cool folks. And all of us here who've been here a little bit longer, I know that if you ever need anything, just holler and you will be supported. With that said, let's get to the last panelist. Last but not least, I must say, Zain, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Priyanka. Hi, I'm Zain Asgar. I'm the GM and GVP of Pixie and the open source group at New Relic. I'm also an adjunct professor of computer science at Stanford. So I've worked in software for a long time and mostly been a consumer of open source. I used to be in the big data space, so I worked with pretty much all the big data tools like Spark and Hadoop and all of that. And recently started working on observability when I co-founded Pixie Labs as the co-founder and CEO. And my big movement into open source was basically making Pixie open source and also part of CNCF after we were acquired in the new Relic. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Zain is actually on our board of the CNCF. So I get to talk to him quite frequently about Pixie and all things cloud native. So it's quite fun. Thank you, everybody, for introducing yourselves. As I'm sure the attendees you are noticing, this is quite an experienced group over here with all kinds of different perspectives. So I'm really excited to dive in. As most folks are aware, open source is pervasive in the code that runs the world today. Almost every application, any kind of deployment out there is majority code is open source, and what we all build in the companies tends to be glue code that gives us the business logic that we need. Open source tooling and software in business forms and just project forms is also gaining a lot of traction every day. And in CNCF, that's the bread and butter of our operation. So I see it every day. Observability is no exception. So CNCF releases these end user tech radars, which are technology thought leadership pieces by end users who utilize these technologies. And they pick a topic, and they recently published one on observability because it's important enough. It's more than important enough. And there's a wide plethora of solutions and tools available. And there's some proprietary, there's some open source, there's all kinds of mixes. And I'm curious to hear from you folks on what do you think is the reason open source is critical for observability for cloud native applications? Who'd like to go first?
I suppose I can get us started.
Yes.
Yeah, so when I think about modern deployments, I think of small, loosely coupled services and some combination of proprietary applications and some applications which are purely open source, off the shelf stuff. And these apps are written in a variety of languages and frameworks. And if each of these apps has its own requirements around observability and emits observability data in its own way, then this represents a high operational burden. And so what you really want is you want all these applications to speak the same language in terms of observability, even if they're written in different languages and frameworks. And open source is critical to this. If you imagine trying to take a set of apps, which is a mix of proprietary and open source, and using a proprietary language for observability, that seems really challenging. And so open source definitely plays a crucial role.
Got it. No, that's super helpful. Bartek, what's your response to that? Strong disagree? Let's throw some papers in the
I
air.
think it makes all sense. And for me, I feel it's very critical that we have lots of observability, in open source. And to me, this is because observability is key to troubleshooting and reliability work or on anything else, on any other software. So if we have less access to those tools, it essentially reduces innovation in other fields, right? Because people spend time recreating those tools and creating everything from scratch. So open source enables a common observability tooling, patterns, API, standards, so we can reuse those and build on those strong foundations and essentially save our precious time, right? Stopping reinventing the wheel and sharing knowledge. So to me, that's essential.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Anyone from the Pixie crew want to chime in?
Sure. So one thing I wanted to add is, part of the benefit of having things like OpenTelemetry is that, as you said, Priyanka, a lot of business logic is, a lot of companies basically work on implementing the business glue logic around a bunch of different open source projects.
Yep.
And having something like OpenTelemetry allows you to instrument the core infrastructure in a flexible, open manner, so that you don't have to recreate that, as Bartek said earlier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in your experience, Melissa, in the OSPO, are you seeing lots of conversations around open source observability?
Definitely. I think when you're talking about observability, which is, core, how do you make sure everything is up and running and performing as it should? And you're talking about a variety of architectures and languages and frameworks, to bring that all together in a standardized way is like one of the core benefits of having open source, having this standard way to talk to each other, no matter what language or architecture or framework you're using.
Absolutely. Michelle, anything you want to add?
No, yeah, I think everybody kind of summarized my thoughts already. But I mean, I do want to add, it is really just like very special to have this community where it's like, sure, at the end of the day, everybody's application is different, but you kind of run into the same issues. So being able to share that knowledge across just like so many different teams and so many different companies, that is just what is so special about it.
Oh, that's such a good point. Open source observability is not just essential because our software has evolved that way or technology is needed, but also because people need it, as I think you're alluding to, Michelle, where we all end up solving similar problems. We actually see that in the CNCF end user community very much, where they have these closed room developer experience calls where only end users can join. And end users are defined as folks who consume cloud native technologies, don't sell products or services on them. And that's what happens. You'll be surprised how sometimes maybe an automotive company can support a music streaming apps engineers based on their past experience. So it sounds, just based on this first question that I had for you folks, it's very clear the criticality of open source observability. And Melissa mentioned how standardization that is based on open source is going to go a really long way in helping everybody involved. So let's talk about that a little bit. What do we see is the importance of standards such as of OpenTelemetry, open metrics around observability? Maybe Jack, you would like to take this.
Sure. Standards in technology and engineering are really useful in general because, as Bartek pointed out in the first question, what they allow you to do is spend less time on integration problems and more time building useful products. When a standard exists and when it's thoughtful and well adopted, it's the obvious choice. It's not something you need to think about. An example that comes to mind is hundreds of years ago, there were competing systems for weighing and measuring things. Nowadays, there's no decision. We all use metric units. And even for the folks that think they're using imperial units out there, the imperial system is actually based fundamentally. The definitions are defined based on the metric system. So 1 inch is defined as exactly 2.54 centimeters. So imperial units is just metric units in disguise. And I think OpenTelemetry has the potential to become that standard for observability. And if that happens, then there would be a lot less duplicated effort, which would allow the overall quality of instrumentation to increase. And for application authors, what that means is that it would be easier to obtain observability data. Ideally, the majority of libraries and frameworks would just have OpenTelemetry instrumentation baked in, and application owners won't have to do anything special to monitor their apps besides maybe configuring where the data is shipped off to so that they can consume it.
That's very interesting. Bartek, you are also very involved in the standards world, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
Definitely. I love those kind of directions we are taking here in the CNCF, and I fully agree with everything Jack said. And I just want to add that we already see the fruits of like open standards, and the key part is the stability of the standard, so people can trust that this will not change, so they can build upon that. So we've seen that with open metrics, which is based on like very strong Prometheus exposition format established in like 2015, and that's why we see huge ecosystem of exporters, and literally for everything: eBPF, containers, Linux, Minecraft servers, even plant health for gardening, right? Crazy stuff. Almost every cloud application is expected to have some kind of open metric support. So it's pretty wild. I want to also focus on this open world, word, right? It's very important for the standard to be open. So it's like in the middle ground, between all companies, bigger and smaller. And open source is a great place for that because, it just builds this trust that no one can, maybe destroy or impact this protocol in a maybe some kind of inevaluable way. So open standard with open governance is gives everyone opportunity to contribute for overall value of the standard. So that's great, right?
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with you folks. I mean, open source, and in my personal opinion, a place like CNCF is a great spot to go develop anything that you want to build into a standard, because what you need is industry collaboration. So things need to be structured in a way that that's going to be most incentivized. But here's the confusion here. Particularly, I'm directing this to Jack and Bartek. If I put my, first time hearing about this hat on, which is not the case, but I'm going to just do that. I heard you folks completely align on like, hey, standards are essential. And then we talked about OpenTelemetry, and we also talked about open metrics. So I'm kind of sensing a little bit of a standard sprawl here. Back in the day when I was working on open tracing, we used to reference the XKCD comic, which says, we must have standards, and then somebody releases the 15th standard. And so I would love to hear first you folks' take on open telemetry, open metrics, like what are we even supposed to focus on? And then I'd like to open it to the rest of the panelists for their take on the standard sprawl out there.
Yeah, happy to start this time. So I don't think a large amount of options, is necessarily a bad thing. It's key and very important thing to encourage friendly innovations in this space. And actually, one of the most important missions in the CNCF is like no kings making rule, where we are not here to choose winners. It's rather helping communities, to help and grow and help those who bring the most value, right? And I think the most important part here is that we don't have 30 standards, but 2. That's already a huge win. And there is a truth that those 2 standards are not, especially the OpenTelemetry metric part and open metrics are right now not compatible, but we are working together and we are learning from each other, and each of those parties brings some value. I'm super excited about this. Yes, there's maybe a little bit, competition, but it's very healthy, very friendly. And I'm looking forward to what we can build on top of that, because again, it's just much smaller amount of options here.
That's a fair point. We're not at 15, folks. We're at 2. Jack, you want to address that as well?
Yeah, sure. So, there's definitely some sprawl, but I think most of the work that's being done today is being done, from a good faith effort to build on the work that's come before, and incorporate the learnings and hopefully produce something better. One thing I want to point out is that I think OpenTelemetry actually, to some extent, has the opportunity to actively reduce sprawl. One of the important components in the ecosystem is the OpenTelemetry collector. And so rather than simply introducing a new standard, OpenTelemetry has introduced this collector component, which acts as an adapter for compatibility with other standards. So it accepts telemetry data in lots of different protocols like Zipkin and Jaeger and Prometheus and more, and maps them to a common representation so you can do useful things in a centralized location. And so to me, this is like, imagine if there was a new cell phone charging or data standard that came out to replace USB-C. And instead of just forcing you to buy all new data charging bricks and cables, there was like an adapter that allowed your old cables and charging bricks to work with it. That's what I think of as the collector. And so, I'm really on board with how OpenTelemetry and the collector have provided a graceful way to adopt a new standard while still playing nice with the existing protocols.
Very cool. Michelle, do you want to chime in? What are your thoughts as a Pixie project contributor, which relies a little bit on these standards creations?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I found that being able to have these standards makes it so easy to just provide use to people from Pixie immediately. So for example, a lot of people ask, oh, is Pixie, does it work with Grafana? Does it work with Prometheus and all these other different open source tools? And by being able to provide, using these connectors that Jack was talking about, we're able to say things like, yes, like automatically, immediately, with just like, you don't have to go and do a very specific thing for each tool. It just automatically works across the wide range. And that has just been so instrumental for us.
Excellent. I'm very glad to hear that. So I want to, before we, open out the conversation to like slightly different topics, I'd love to understand the state or the maturity level of OpenTelemetry today, and also OpenMetrics, since both came up.
Yeah, I suppose I can start with OpenTelemetry. So OpenTelemetry is a lot of different things. And there's several different components, for lack of a better word, that are at different stages of maturity. And they're maturing at different rates for each of the core OpenTelemetry data types, which are metrics, traces, and logs. To start, there's the SDKs and the APIs. And these are essentially libraries written in a variety of languages. And the APIs are what library and framework maintainers will use to instrument their code. And the SDKs are what application owners use to configure what happens with the telemetry data that's generated. So on this front, tracing is the furthest along. Several languages have released stable versions. And metrics is next. So the metrics spec has stabilized for OpenTelemetry, and several languages are expected to release stable versions in Q1 of 2022. Logs, the last data type, it's not exactly clear when we can expect stable versions of APIs and SDKs, but I think a safe bet is the second half of 2022. Next, there's instrumentation. So there's going to be instrumentation code that's built on top of these APIs for the popular libraries and frameworks of each respective language. And the story varies from language to language, but generally the languages that are further along with stable API and SDK implementations are going to offer more on the instrumentation front as well, since the APIs are the building blocks of instrumentation. Closely related to instrumentation are the OpenTelemetry semantic inventions. And what these are is these describe standards for how to shape telemetry data for common operations. So in a nutshell, if you're instrumenting a HTTP server that's written in Java, it should emit telemetry data that is similar in shape to an HTTP server that's written in Python. And the semantic inventions are what allows this to happen. And so there's been progress on this front, especially in the area of HTTP servers and messaging systems, but everything is still experimental for now. And then, I talked about the OpenTelemetry collector before. I just want to provide like a quick update on that. So if you haven't heard of it, the collector, it's really important in OpenTelemetry. It's essentially a highly configurable and extensible data pipelining tool. It's a bit of a Swiss Army knife. You deploy it to your environment and can configure it to do everything from data enrichment and normalization to tail-based sampling for distributed tracing and monitoring of infrastructure and more. And it's reached stability for traces, but not yet for metrics and logs, since those are still works in progress. So there's a lot of moving parts, and there's been tremendous progress. And I'd say that up to this point, a lot of the work has been foundational in nature. We're defining the core data types and the common APIs and SDKs. And once metrics and logs stabilize, I anticipate OpenTelemetry to get a lot more interesting as we start to see folks build upon those foundational pieces. So that's a quick update on the state of OTel. It's a work in progress, but there's definitely progress.
Good stuff. It's a lot of progress. Things are moving fast. And do you want to, Bartek, chime in on the OpenMetrics?
Sure. I will take only like a couple of seconds. So OpenMetrics things are much easier because OpenMetrics is just a network protocol, let's say, for exposing your metrics. And it's version 1.0, GA, with exemplars, with compatibility with Prometheus text exposition for majority of things. And we are actually looking on 2.0 soon with the high resolution sparse histogram feature. And we also have pending RFC to IATF to make it like official standard in this kind of, weird font from 90s. I love it. Yeah, the status.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, so this is great stuff. But as I think Jack said very correctly, everything's a work in progress, and that's the sort of this, the state of being when you work in software, and definitely open source software. So Zain, I'm curious, what advice would you give someone who's trying to figure out how they should operationalize observability in their organizations, given that A, we are a work in progress, and B, we will probably always be a work in progress? I think you're muted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry about that. I think that's a pretty complex question to answer, and it really just depends on the type of organization and what you're interested in doing. So I think there are a lot of people who can operationalize open source software well, install it and maintain it themselves. And I think that's a fine path to go down. There's also obviously all sorts of supported open source software you can buy, right? If you're not actually interested in maintaining the software yourself. I actually think for most people that's probably the right option, because they'll end up spending more in operationalizing it than actually getting it through a vendor. But the flexibility of open source, I think, is still great to have.
I think that is a very fair point. And now I think I'd like to steer this conversation towards the future. I think something I've been noticing in conversations with you, Zain, with others in the ecosystem, is how eBPF is becoming a really interesting story for the observability ecosystem. And it's like changing the way how we think about observability. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I can take a quick pass at it. So as for those that are not completely aware of this, Pixie is an observability system that uses eBPF to collect data without adding manual instrumentation, and then we can export data in various formats, including things like OpenTelemetry. So part of the interesting thing about eBPF is that you can basically instrument things using the Linux kernel. So eBPF is this sandbox that runs inside of the Linux kernel that allows you to basically run code that will essentially insert code in the Linux kernel and make sure that it doesn't break your machine, right? So it's like a kernel module, but a lot safer. So it allows you to do things like probe your applications, look at network traffic, and things like that without having to install like a language-specific or application-specific agent. So part of what we do with Pixie is we enable lots of cool things like, we can help you take a look at all the traffic, even if you don't have any collectors installed. In addition, we can do things like dynamically instrument your applications and also provide flame graphs for your applications. You can debug performance problems. And all of this is done using eBPF, which is pretty cool, right? It's a very new emerging technology that's being used all the way from network traffic to telling you how much CPU like individual functions are taking. So I think it's pretty revolutionary in that way.
So do you think in the future, eBPF will become the basis of how we do observability across the board?
So I mean, I actually think that there will be many solutions, right? Observability is a pretty complex space. Yeah. So doing things like OpenTelemetry and making sure all the core infrastructure is well instrumented, I think goes a long way. Using things like eBPF for parts of the application stack that are not well instrumented, or doing more dynamic instrumentation for what I call like production or debugging in production. I think those will be the new interesting cases with eBPF.
Gotcha. What are some other cool new emerging trends in observability besides eBPF? Anyone, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I can throw some. So yeah. I'm always excited by new ideas, and one of those is like continuous profiling. So we talk about this, hey, we have 3 observability signals. Maybe that's a 4th one, like continuous profiling, right? Which allows you to have like a profile of your application, usage of memory or CPU or anything else, in the past, and you can kind of snapshot that and merge and kind of find the bottleneck. And even if your application went out of the memory, you can take a look back retrospectively and check what was actually leaking, let's say, in the memory. So that's something we kind of, it's already in open source. There is kind of, we hope in the CNCF soon as well, but this is super amazing stuff. Of course, observability correlations, so being able to link different observability signals together on UI, and things like exemplars and open telemetry context propagation, and kind of creating logs from or metrics from traces, all of those kind of connections between signals. Yeah, I could speak a lot, but yeah, that's the main ones.
No, that is so cool. This is why I love this space. Observability, there is so much to be done, and the crew that works on it, all you folks, there's always innovation in your minds. There's like, oh, we figured this out. Let's bring eBPF in. Let's do continuous profiling. And so this is a space, as I told you, I got interested in infrastructure because of observability. I think it's super dynamic. And folks who are listening, check all these projects out. Check out what they do, because if nothing else, you will find some really interesting, cool tech to look at. Speaking of interesting, cool new tech to look at, let's talk a little bit about the project Pixie. Michelle, I would love to hear from you about, we've all discussed how, okay, it's a CNCF sandbox project, but tell us more about what Pixie does, and then why New Relic decided to make it open source and contribute it to CNCF.
Yeah, so I think Zain also gave a great overview of Pixie earlier, but it's just like, using technologies such as eBPF, we're able to provide instant visibility into your cluster without, any complicated deployments. All you have to do is just run one simple command, which is our CLI px deploy, and immediately you just get tons of data about your system, from network traffic to error rates. So yeah, Pixie is just being able to provide that experience and ship all this data out to other interesting places or viewable through our UI. Yeah, so I guess your other question was just, why did New Relic decide to go and acquire Pixie and then open source it? And I think it was just because, they strongly believe in this open source vision, where it's we've been saying this whole time, that the future of observability is open source. So before, it was always something that we thought about, before Pixie was acquired, it's should we open source Pixie? And we weren't sure about the idea. So being able to have somebody come in and support us in that, and being able to do that is just very, very special.
Yes, absolutely. And how does it, I'm curious, how does it feel now working on Pixie in a very different set of circumstances? You're suddenly open source, you're part of this foundation, you're also working at New Relic. I'm just curious, how has the experience evolved?
Yeah, for me, I think it's been really great. I think there are, of course, small things that we realized when we decided to open source Pixie, and we saw it's just oh no, we have a lot of embarrassing code here that now suddenly all these people are going to see. And of course, that's a part of it, but the other part is just being able to now fully interact with this community and share with people, what we're doing, and get all this feedback and insight from others who, as we've said, it's just this space is so huge. There's so many use cases and things that need to be done. So hearing other people's ideas and thoughts about just where we can take Pixie has been really great.
Yeah.
And also just being able to just talk to all these people about potential integrations. We use so many of these tools, and being able to see Pixie data in there, for example, is just very exciting to me.
That is, yes, I can totally see that. I'm so glad it's working out. Actually, Melissa, you must have been involved in a large capacity as the decisions were being made on open sourcing, etc. I'd love to hear what your experience was like, where you were most worried, and how has it all turned out?
I think it was, it was an experience, right? We acquired Pixie, and we turn around and put the code out there and open source. And in any project like that, there's surprises and bumps along the way. But the net result of doing that work and putting in that work and putting it out in open source has just been so beneficial. To see so many people being able to get the code quickly, easily, install it, run it, and see the benefit is exactly what you want when you put code out there in open source. And the community has really come out and shown us that they saw this need for this technology and are excited to try it out and do use it for their systems.
Excellent. I am very glad to hear that. So actually, I'm curious, what should people look out for from Pixie in the next, let's say, year?
Yeah, so I can take a pass of that.
Yes.
So we've been obviously working at a bunch of features. So, as Bartek mentioned, things like continuous profiling are very interesting. We've implemented that using eBPF, but it has pretty limited support on compiled languages right now. And we're just about to expand that to, languages like Java and hopefully Node.js and Python soon. So I think that feature set of just getting more deep application visibility is something that we're going to constantly be working on. Another area that we've been pushing a lot on is just around this idea of like data science for infrastructure. One of the things I believe in is like observability in some ways should be just like a regular part of every developer's toolkit, and not just, maybe it'll evolve into something else, but not just about observing, but in terms of like actually taking action. So one of the talks that we gave at KubeCon was around data science for infrastructure and how to use information from Pixie to dynamically change your Kubernetes cluster. So those are the types of things that we're interested in experimenting on next.
Very cool. And if folks are interested in, starting to contribute to Pixie, what are areas that you'd be like, hey, please come here. This is the area I need the most help. What would you say? Yeah,
so Pixie has this concept of pixel scripts, which are basically, pandas compliant or mostly compliant scripts. And pandas is like a data processing library that a lot of data science people use in Python. So we have this concept of pixel scripts that actually can both instrument and process data. And we're always looking for people to contribute new pixel scripts for different use cases. Like, here's how you best monitor a Kafka system or a service that talks to Kafka. And we really hope to build out like a repository of scripts. So that's like one area that's ripe for contribution. We're also always looking for new support for protocols. Someone just implemented a Thrift protocol and submitted it to Pixie. So things like that are very good for the project overall, for it to become more usable by the community.
Excellent. And what about on the OpenTelemetry front? What do you folks want to see in terms of contributions?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is for folks just to get out there and start using OpenTelemetry. So with all this work that's been on the foundational pieces like the API and SDK development, there has maybe been some neglect of things like documentation, and we just need more. I think, amongst other things, we need more real world users to get feedback from, so that we can know where to improve. So yeah, I'd say download or add OpenTelemetry to your project. And if you run into issues, come talk to us in the CNCF Slack, or open an issue on GitHub. And if you're feeling up to it, maybe open a pull request. So yeah, the more the merrier.
Yes, I always tell people, take a PR first approach, just because you never know when you might have really helped a project out, and you are just by taking that mindset, you're going to break your own barriers of how much involvement you can have. I want to ask a question related to OpenTelemetry metrics. So Prometheus is, as I also see it, the de facto standard for metrics in Kubernetes, right? In the Kubernetes world. So are OTel metrics based off of it, or is it different? I'm curious.
So they're different. So, it depends on exactly what you mean, but OpenTelemetry is defining APIs that allow you to instrument code with metrics, right? But OpenTelemetry also has this thing called the OpenTelemetry protocol, which is how to transmit OpenTelemetry data over the wire. And so that protocol is what you might refer to as is it the same thing as Prometheus? And no, it's not. Prometheus, the standard way to do it is to expose a metrics endpoint, which displays your metrics data in a particular format. OTLP, or OpenTelemetry protocol, is not like that. That's primarily a binary protocol that's based on HTTP and gRPC that defines protobuf messages that describe how to represent traces, metrics, and logs. And so, no, not quite the same thing. But with that said, OpenTelemetry metrics, one of the core design principles was full Prometheus compatibility. And so that's not going anywhere. So if you have an application that emits data in Prometheus format, it will be translatable in a first-class way to OpenTelemetry. And the way that will work in a practical manner is you can configure the collector, which is the component that I talked about, to scrape your existing Prometheus endpoints and bring those metrics into the collector. And, as I mentioned, they get mapped to a common representation where you can do things like normalization or, data enrichment before exporting to whatever backend you ultimately want to store those in, which can also be Prometheus, because Prometheus is like the format that applications expose metrics in, but also, a database and querying tool, right? So you can scrape metrics with the collector and then send those to Prometheus. So they're different, but OpenTelemetry metrics should be fully compatible with Prometheus.
Gotcha. So real user monitoring, I think in the this is the latest. Everyone is very cares a lot about real user monitoring when it comes to observability. I remember back in the day, I feel so ancient, when I was working on open tracing. I was at a company called Lightstep, and we were often thinking about just how do we provide insights and information to the people who look at this data to know, for example, customer A is having a terrible experience right now while everybody else might be just fine, but customer A is like the largest customer I have, so I better get on it. Or, hey, the CEO is looking through the application and the latency is high. How do we fix that? And so I'm curious about if that is going to be a part of the OpenTelemetry world. Bartek, do you have any thoughts?
If I understand the question correctly, it's around like kind of smart processing of this data after you gather them, right?
Yes.
And that's a powerful notion, and really this is where gathering all the events from your application is important, because then you can know that decide which of those are important, more important, less important. And that's kind of the definitely that would be more solutions around this, like maybe even AI or some kind of pattern matching, where you see that a certain data is more useful than other parts of data, and what to bring to the user. And I think it's very important on the kind of OpenTelemetry, especially on tracing side, because there's lots of data, right? And usually it's auto-instrumented. Usually, ideally, machines sort this data out and bring only reduce the amount of what's human readable, really, right? So I think it's very important. But do we see this? I think we are working on like basics right now to ensure that you can efficiently collect all those traces. And I think we're working on a smart sampling, which is there are so many kind of techniques, and the best one I seen was like a tail-based sampling, where actually you decide if you have you kind of collect some data around when you know what happened to the request. Maybe it was too slow, so you only gather too slow requests, things like that. And I think we are slowly stepping up into big AI kind of systems, but it's kind of in future.
It's more futuristic. Got it. And I think this conversation is like, I think in a spot at which the conversation about observability is also starting to feel a little bit like a conversation around APM, or application performance monitoring. And I'm curious, especially from the New Relic folks, to hear about just how do you differentiate between observability and APM? How about, let's see, do you want to go for it, Melissa?
Sure, I can give my high level thoughts.
Yes.
So for observability, we're looking at let me start with APM. So APM is going to collect your data. It's going to monitor your applications, right? That's the core purpose of APM. From observability, we want to actually be able to do something with that data. We want to collect that data and see where those spikes are, where are those signals that are showing us that there is something going on with our system that we need to take action on. And when we're monitoring all of these systems and getting all this great data from APM and more systems, we're going to have more data that we need to sift through and be able to see which ones are really something that needs action, or that something that may be indicating that an event will happen that we can perhaps prevent. So the observability is going to give it that whole picture and point out to us the important pieces of data that are going to help us keep our systems up and running and recover quickly when there is an issue.
That's really helpful. Would you agree with this description, Zain?
Yeah, so I think APM is fundamentally about getting the signals, and observability is really about understanding how your code is working, and being able to take action on that, and really get an understanding of here's what's going on, here's what I need to do to go fix it.
Yep, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. Excuse me. Now I'd like to, go back to this conversation we were having about open source contributions. I've been sprinkling throughout this conversation that, hey, folks, contribute. And so in general, what is your advice to folks on how to get started contributing to open source? And of course, you can plug how your project makes it easy as well. Maybe Michelle, you can start.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that everybody is always worried about when you just join this new community is just like doing that initial step in and like diving deep into the water. And so I think it really is like the first step is just, you're using the tool yourself and you see areas where there's like, you have a feature request. Like even, I guess in some people's minds, it's like contributing is just like, going in and writing code, but there's so many other ways that you could contribute. So it's like with, putting in feature requests, finding bugs. I think even just like, I think Jack mentioned this earlier, but it's just like, honestly, a lot of open source projects, they need help with documentation. I think things are moving so quickly all of the time that it's hard to keep track of those things. So just even making the tool easier for people to use by contributing to documentation is just amazing.
100% agree with that. In CNCF, as you know, we have 114, actually, as of today, 115 projects because Dapper just joined. And that's what every maintainer contributor is telling me, that please don't wait to, send that PR that will revolutionize this project with your code. No, start at we have like the tagging of good first issues where it's simple stuff, or it's like go help, not even write the documentation, go read it and fix typos. That can be even a great way to get started. I think there is a huge barrier that people face until they submit a PR. And so I encourage anybody who's even like moderately interested to go just do the smallest possible thing you can and know that it will be appreciated. It won't be seen as, oh, you fixed a typo. It'll be like, oh my gosh, thank God somebody noticed that. So just please keep that in mind. If you're listening, if you're watching this, that anything you do is going to be in support of the greater mission. And I would also say that includes non GitHub touching contribution as well. There are just 2-3 weeks ago, we concluded the flagship conferences we host, KubeCon, Cloud Native Cons, which are the largest open source conferences in the world. I see all the folks planning that event, all the folks who come who come and like man booths, who help people set up for the experience. They're all contributing. So I think there is a myth out there that the only way to be part of open source is to be a programmer, and that too like a wizard of one. No, every little piece counts. Every little thing you do counts. And I think people just knowing that is probably really good. Anyone else want to chime in on how people should get started with contributions?
One thing I would add is that, just if there's a project you're interested in, or if there's
Yeah.
a project you're using,
Yeah.
clone it, bring it down locally, run it,
Yeah.
run the build.
Good
You
point.
know, make it something that's more concrete and not just this this kind of fuzzy hand wavy thing that you depend on. I swear the code is way more approachable than you might think. So yeah, just give it a try.
That's a really, really good point. In terms of all this open source efforts going on, do you the Pixie folks, this is for you, you're already part of CNCF, the best place to be. Do you plan to integrate other open source projects into CNCF? What should we be preparing for?
We don't know yet in terms of exactly. I mean, Pixie is a pretty much kind of a larger mono project, right? Like all of our UIs and stuff are built in. It is possible that over the next couple of years, we'll probably break apart some parts of Pixie and then contribute them as separate projects, depending on how things go. And then there may be other projects like OpenTelemetry collectors and stuff that we might contribute.
Awesome. How has the process been for you to become a part to start open sourcing to a foundation? Was it a completely different experience than just pure open sourcing? I'm curious.
I mean, I think it's a little bit of a different experience. I've got to say, CNCF actually made things really easy. We had this, checklist that was, I got to say, fairly long, but actually very complete and very helpful to get through. And I think at the end of the day, it makes the project a lot better, right? Just like making sure you have the vendor neutrality, like front and center, making sure that everything is up to a certain bar. I think is great to have, and we've been super happy with our experience so far.
Excellent. I am very glad to hear that. And there's always a service desk for every project. If you need anything, ping us.
Yep. And I'm still shocked by how fast the service desk is.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear it. Super cool. All right. So it seems like, as I hope we on this panel have conveyed to the folks who are listening, open source is is not the big scary thing. It's a great place to join in, get involved, find a community, and also advance your career. So participating seems great. What about the challenges of using open source in your companies, in your organizations? And I know, Zain, you had briefly touched on it, as for some folks it may not be worth it, but how should people determine today I'm going to get all in and use this open source library directly, this other thing I'm gonna buy a managed service? How should people decide that? How about Bartek? Maybe you can start.
Yeah, sure. So maybe so I definitely feel, there are many challenges in using open source. Nothing is easy, but I will be a little bit biased because at my company, RedHat, we do everything in open source, including, production configuration.
True.
However, I talk with contributor, I talk with vendors and open source communities, and I feel stability is very important. So I think we can do a bit more work around, making sure the license, stays the same, that we understand other licenses and, the rationales for that and how this impact other open source projects, like, recent moves into AGPL or SSPL or all those. I wish from the developer perspective that I don't need to care about that, right? Of course, this is for the reason, but I wish there would be a way for everyone to have easier choice, to not think about and having lawyers and all of those. And I think, this is one of the challenge in open source, how to monetize that in a safe manner, right? Yeah, that would be my first challenge.
Yes, that makes sense. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you can go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to, second that with the licenses that, and thinking about the licenses. And I think to highlight that with something like the CNCF, where we have a foundation, and there's policies and rules, and the licenses are going to be, a certain set of licenses that will be used. And so that gives you, when you use projects from foundations like CNCF, you have that comfort level that you will there will be some stability in that project because there are policies and rules set up to keep that going, along with the vendor neutrality, as Zain mentioned earlier. So when you're looking at deploying the open source yourself, picking up open source from foundations is a great way to go if you're looking for stability.
Such a good point. Jack, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so what I was going to say is actually related to what Melissa just mentioned. And so, one of the challenges of working in open source is trying to pick projects that will continue to be maintained. It's not ideal to start using a project and come across a bug and go to update the version just to find out that the project is no longer maintained. And the fact that this happens shouldn't be surprising. Things come and go. And also, many open source projects are maintained by a relatively small number of individuals and often outside of their day job. And I think one thing that we need to do to combat that is have more participation in open source in general, and especially from companies. So my employer, New Relic, is good about this. But I have worked for employers that make you jump through a lot of hoops just to contribute bug fixes back to the projects you depend on. And so in general, I think companies should take an extra effort to reduce the red tape and try to play a more active role in maintaining the open source projects that they depend on. So, try to fight this, many projects maintained by the few and make it more balanced. And on that note, I actually have to run. I have to give another, I have to be involved in another Nerd Days talk. I'm going to be instrumenting an application in Java with OpenTelemetry. So if you're interested in that, come hang out with me. But it's been great talking with you all. And
thanks for joining us, Jack.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we have 4 minutes to go. Do the remaining panelists want to ask each other any questions? I shouldn't be the only one who gets to do this.
Yes, I can. I have one maybe tricky question, but I'm super curious. What is the secret sauce especially in Pixie team around portability? Because when you play with eBPF, it's very powerful. It's very it allows you to do really anything. Inject your code in kernel, so the thing that controls everything. And the problem is it's kind of sometimes fragile. I managed to set up some k-probes or trace points on my machine, but when I shown that to my colleague, she wasn't able to run it because we had different kernel versions. So how Pixie helps? I mean, how Pixie kind of solve that? I think it has to be hard work here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that happens behind the scenes for that. I mean, we have to package up certain Linux kernel headers. We always make sure compatibility with usually an older kernel. Things usually tend to work as you move forward. They just don't work on if you build for 5.10, it's probably not going to work on an older Linux kernel. So I think we target 4.12 right now as our base kernel that we target. There's also a bunch of stuff to figure out what the offsets are, especially for uprobes. If you're curious, you can probably go take a look at the code inside of source Sterling BPF, and I can even point you to it if you're interested.
Definitely, you need to be very close to kernel development, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess another thing to check out, I might as well plug it here, is if you check out our blog, blog.px.dev, we talk a bunch about how we overcome some of these issues with BPF.
Oh, I used that already. I used this blog post already to prepare my demo for PromCon. So that's great job on that. I love it.
Oh, thanks.
Excellent. So we're almost at time here, folks. I'm curious, any final thoughts from anybody? I think, Michelle, I'd love to hear what did you think maybe of this panel, and maybe you think that something to round out this conversation for the benefit of the attendees.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody in this panel just comes from a wide range of different experiences. For me, I mentioned Pixie is my first kind of foray into the open source. So just being able to also hear other perspectives from Bartek, who's been just the community for such a long time, has been really great. So I hope just everybody got a good takeaway of just what is so special about having observability be open source and just how it benefits everybody and how they can get involved.
Yes, absolutely. Melissa, any parting words?
I think what we learned in this is that, yes, observability is all over open source. And so it's a great time to jump in and get involved because things are evolving, things are changing. It's a great time to start taking a look, start installing, looking at documentation, and contributing back, even if it's just feedback on how it works for your system.
Absolutely. Zain, what would you like to say as your final thoughts?
Oh, I mean, I've been super happy to be part of the open source community, especially the CNCF community and observability. It's, you know, for Michelle and I think this has been like the first big open source contribution we have made, and it's been, you know, it's been amazing to work with everybody. Very welcoming group of people. So,
yay! Excellent. Bartek, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would just really would like to finish with like some call for action, right? If you are looking into, you know, how you can grow your career, help, just really start contributing. Like close your eyes and put this issue. Maybe something silly at the start. Don't worry, we all make mistakes. We never, you know, humiliate anyone. Everyone is friendly in CNCF, so far I've seen. So please really do this, just do this, right? And you know, search for mentorships. And I also want to encourage project maintainers to really grow in this mentoring effort as well. I know it takes time. I know technically no one pays you for that, but it like we hired so many people from that. We got new maintainers. That's I think the most valuable thing I would love to finish with.
Absolutely. Yes. And I would like to echo all of the panelists in that open source, and especially the cloud native ecosystem, we are all team cloud native, and our strength is our diversity. And we welcome each and every one of you. I think observability is seeing so much innovation, and that a lot of it is coming from open source. And that's going to continue being the case. So come on in, get involved, and enjoy the ride with us. With that said, thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your conference. Bye-bye.